I want to break here and introduce our first guest, Brian Murphy. He's an associate professor of history at Rutgers University, Newark, and he is currently a contributing editor at Talking Points Memo and has been seen several times on MSNBC as a contributor. Professor Murphy is also in the process of writing a book about the corruption throughout American history, and he is leading a public history project to develop the Great Falls National Historic Park with the Organization of American Historians and the National Park Service. Brian, thanks so much for joining me. How are you today?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me on. Doing well.
Thanks so much. Great, man. And we'll have you up on the screen momentarily. Listen, I want to put these things in context. I need, if you could help me put some of these things into historical context, particularly as it pertains to this pandemic. Let's start there. The pandemic, I've been curious as to how much of the same level of absurdity we saw in 1918 that we're seeing right now. The anti-maskers, the politicization of it. We are getting, I don't know how long it's going to take for us to actually meet and supersede the death totals. But we are getting into some unbelievably historic and tragic numbers. And then all of the games that are being played by our political leaders at this point. Can you contextualize this from a historical perspective?
It's a great question. The thing is, we should know better by now, right? This isn't the first pandemic or epidemic that this country's had. And there were anti-maskers in the 1918 case too, right? There were people who denied it. There were people who wanted to pretend it would go away on its own, and it didn't. But we know so much more now, and the quality of information that's available on how to fight diseases and how to deal with this. Now people not only know that masks work, but they have a better idea of why they work. And they have access to much better masks, right? They didn't have an N95 in 1918. There were people smoking cigarettes through masks, putting holes in them in that pandemic, right? Because the most important thing about it is to be able to light one up when you just need to relax during the flu.
Right.
But I think the way this got dragged into what's different, I think, in this case is really the way that's got dragged into the way that everything gets dragged into this polarized narrative that we have now, where, there's a conservative way to approach this, and there's the way that everybody else deals with it. And it was kind of cringy at first, right? To think like, oh God, you could see what Trump was going to do with this. Like, they're going to make wearing masks uncool. And that's exactly what they did, right? And now here we are.
Here we are, 500,000. Well, actually, the number of people who are dying on a daily basis outdates our numbers by almost magnitudes of order. But I keep saying 500,000, but we're actually at about 550,000 at this juncture. And the historical, do we ever learn? Like, I know that's a kind of a broad question, a really lofty philosophical question, but to me, it's almost as if even if the masses reject common sense, like you said, we had an anti-mask movement in 1918, people cutting holes in masks. We've seen this before. You would think, though, that there would be an incentive amongst our leaders to do the right thing to preserve human lives. But if we take this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and we just look at how this government and the ruling elite have treated it, it suggests something entirely different. Like, we can actually hypothesize that they don't give a damn about human lives. They only care about businesses and corporations and their financial interests. Do we ever move away from that from a historical perspective? And I don't know, man. Like, it's a depressing question because I already know the answer. Just talk to me about it.
Yeah, I think like when you frame it that way, you can really bum yourself out. Um, I would say that there you can decide how that plays out based on what you do now, right? It
Mm,
doesn't have to play out. I think that this is the one thing I think like it, look, it's great to have like historians on a show and we come on and we say, well, this is what happened in the past.
right.
Does that have to mean that how it plays out in the future? Absolutely not. I think one thing that we definitely saw this time around and that we're still seeing is that there's a real instinct on the part of capital to try to figure out
Mm,
how to do this, how to like what is the bare minimum that we have to do to like get people to keep going to work,
yeah.
um and the disconnect between what people actually want, say that what people like say in polls that they want versus what is on the floor of Congress versus what people in Congress are like most people in Congress are willing to support. There's a real big gap there, and I think like if that gap wasn't there I would feel more depressed, right? But
Mm,
the fact
okay.
that people want more, and I think like the fact that there's like you've more or
Mm,
less won the debate on deficits not mattering that much, and you've won the debate on inflation scare tactics, and you've won the debate on whether or not $15 should be the floor of what a minimum wage is. That wasn't there 10 years ago. Like
right.
that is different. So
Yeah.
I think it's easy to talk yourself into feeling pessimistic about this, but it's not. There are reasons to be optimistic.
Yeah. I'm smiling because you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. The people want more. The people are expecting
Yeah.
more. So perhaps maybe the time frame that we should compare this to is the French Revolution. But no, before we go there, though, for those in the audience who understand what we're talking about, anyway, let's shift gears because I don't want to take you too much down that path. Not on this episode. Maybe we'll do it offline. But let's also talk about the context of what's going on with the Republican Party, right? The Republican Party clearly no longer the party of Lincoln. They haven't been the party of Lincoln in my lifetime. But now they're no longer even the party of Reagan. They're most certainly the party of Trump. Talk about that transition and how does that, as a historian, I know you don't project what's going to happen in the future, but based on what's happened in the past, like to me, I feel like this is a potential death knell in the Republican Party as it exists today. Because for them to continuously chase after Donald Trump when he is himself a dividing factor in the party elite, at least, and he does maintain a very solid hold on the voting base of the Republican Party, but you have that same kind of disconnect between the will of the people and the will of the ruling elite. But in this case, it's almost in the opposite direction of what we just talked about in terms of the right direction and the wrong direction. The political elite in the Republican Party, some of them do want to get rid of Donald Trump. They just don't have the spine to do so. Talk about the future of the Republican Party in terms of how they have evolved since Ronald Reagan.
Rush is the bridge, right? Limbaugh. When I think about this, I think Limbaugh is the connecting thread that gets you from Reagan to Trump, and that it's sort of like this fake populism of doing what rich people and the party want, and trying to mobilize anger and fear as much as possible and try to keep it contained. And then they
Mm,
lost interest and ability to keep it contained.
mm,
Um, I think it's if we, if I have friends in Europe who look at American history and just say, well, the Republican Party has become it's like a European Christian nationalist party, right? Like
mm,
it's not we kind of lack the political language here to call it what it is. But if we were looking
mm.
at this in a European context, it would be really obvious what the Republican Party is on track to become. Yeah, it's funny. They're sticking with this guy who lost an election, and they're not going to have a conversation about how to build out. They're going to try to limit the number of people who can vote, and
Mm, mm,
there's not going to be any soul searching.
yeah,
The thinking that like these people are going to get disciplined because of what happened on the 6th. That isn't going to happen.
right.
Um, they're running with it. So it's a,
Right.
they're not a, there's no, right now, I don't see any, like, there's no speed break on any of
Right.
this. It's just going to get, this is only going to get worse for a while.
Is there any really, historical perspective for a strong man in the United States, obviously? Because I mean, like you said, if we talk about Europe, there's plenty of examples. But a strong man who alone had the ability to completely redirect the focus and the and actually no. Let me correct myself because you're let me go back to what you started with. Rush Limbaugh is the bridge, right? And the Republican Party tried to contain that monster, and not just Rush Limbaugh himself, but literally the evils and the bigotry that he promoted and that made him rich and famous. They tried to put a containment field around that energy. And then they found out very quickly, well, it took about 30 years, that they could not contain it and they could not control it. Now Rush Limbaugh is off the scene and Donald Trump is here to do whatever he wants. What happens historically to political parties when they become such an edge party? Like you said, if we compare it to Europe, it's a Christian nationalist party, right? And a very dangerous one at that. When the mainstream in this country is moving in one direction, even if it's moving slowly, right? We're becoming more, the demographics of this country is changing. If nothing else, the demographics alone suggest that this strategy of going behind Donald Trump and doubling down on this Christian nationalism, this faux Christian nationalism, is a losing proposition in one or two election cycles. Do you think that they are just saying, let's just grab one more victory? If they think that they can get a victory in 2024, they're literally not concerned about demographics putting them out of power from 2028 going forward. Do you think that's the strategy?
I think the thing that makes it different than the European context is that we've got the Senate, and they've got ways of controlling the Senate and holding on to it, and they've got gerrymandering. And you just don't have that in other. That is one of the features of the structure of how our republic is set up, and it's got there are some real shortcomings for what that means for representative government.
Right.
And people are going to have to, like, this is why that John Lewis voting right. I would get on that. You're going to run out of time if you don't do this soon, because they will try what they did on the 6th again, and it might work, right? Like if you had a few different people, if we had a Republican majority in the House of Representatives, I think it's a real open question whether or not Biden would have taken that oath, right?
Right. That's a terrifying notion, right? And we were very close. Like the pressure, they would have called it pressure from the people versus an insurrection. If there was a Republican majority in the House, they would have called it pressure, the will of the people. And no, you're right, right? They sincerely, most certainly, and would have thrown that election to Donald Trump or used their machinations, the congressional machinations, to give it to Donald Trump, which really then, in hindsight, makes the 2018 election probably one of the most significant ones in terms of the course of American history. And so. Sure. We have a lot of difficult days ahead, but we can leave it with what you said. If we frame it in the context of what the powerful are doing, it can be depressing. But you're saying that we should frame it in the context of what the people are saying. And the people are not fooled. The people want more. The people are expecting more. Brian, could you just speak to that last point and then tell the audience where they can find your work and how they can support you?
I think like that. There's a real, you mentioned Jefferson at the top of the segment, and Jefferson talked a lot about vigilance, and I think the idea that people who weren't necessarily political or paying attention to this a couple of years ago, like COVID, brings it all into focus about what government can do and how they can get it wrong and how they can get it right. That we've had a real. I think like the latter half of the 20th century took there was a lot of stuff that government used to do that moved out of the sphere of government and into like the private sector and NGOs and foundations and areas that aren't as accountable. And so it's harder to, in a lot of ways, it's harder to do the sphere of elective representative politics is smaller in some ways than it was in the New Deal era. But in a way that we haven't really thought about or talked about. So it's like this confusion about what the role is.
Right.
I think there's a real moment here to rethink that. And there are a lot of younger members of Congress who think about this in a much different way, right? Than anybody, than the older guys do.
Right.
And I think that's a really hopeful sign.
Yeah.
My people want to find me at Rutgers University, Newark. I work on I got a new project on the history of the Passaic River and political economy. I do some work on corruption. I'm working on a project about teaching the Constitution to undergraduates here. And I got some cool projects going on. So if people want to find me, they can find me on Rutgers's webpage and drop me a line.
Absolutely. Brian Murphy, historian, scholar, thank you so much for stopping by. We
Thanks
really
a lot,
appreciate
bro.
it.